Thank you so much for joining us for our second webinar. We have Warwick Badgery, who will be doing his Soil Carbon, Its Limits and Opportunities webinar today. But just before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands and waters in which we gather. I'm on Wiradjuri country based in Orange, and I'd like to recognise their continuing connection to land, water and the community. I'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Indigenous peoples here today. So thank you very much for joining us. Today's session will be recorded and will be available on our website. You will have the link for that from when you did your registrations, and I also sent that out to you today a couple of times. There will be opportunities for questions at the end of the presentation. Feel free to put them in the chat if you, and we'll call on you at the end just so you remember your question. And then lastly, just so that we continuously improve, we have a short survey that'll take you 2 minutes at the end. We just love some feedback about the session. So without further ado, I will introduce Warwick. So Warwick is a principal research scientist with the New South Wales Department Primary Industries and Regional Development team. He's got 20 years experience in the application of system level thinking and improving profitability, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and enhancing sustainability of livestock and crop production systems. So Warwick, over to you.
Thanks, Camilla. Thanks a lot for coming along today. I'm just going to give, I guess, a bit of an overview of the work we've been doing in soil carbon. And just, I guess, the main aim is to try and put soil carbon into context. I'm really going to focus in on it from quite a broad and holistic view about its role in the farming system, how we do increase it or what does increase soil carbon, and then just what you would need to consider if you're looking to either enter into a market with soil carbon, whether that's an ACCU or a voluntary market, or whether you're looking to use it as an offset for a farming business. So it's just trying to put all of that into perspective. I'm not going to really drill down on a lot of the detail, but very happy to take questions as we go or towards the end, which I can pick up at the end, and just cover off on those questions for you. Okay, so I thought I'd just start with covering sort of why carbon's of interest, and really we've got the global warming problem with climate temperatures increasing, and to, I suppose, overcome that, the Paris Agreement was an agreement between all countries that are part of that to try and restrict global warming to about 2 degrees. And by making that decision, that's actually flowed through to the targets and a lot of the drivers of why things are happening now. So to keep things at that target, we have to, I guess, peak our emissions as soon as possible, and then meet a net zero target by 2050. And so this is where the net zero targets that have been adopted federally and at all the state government jurisdictions have all come from, they flow through from that Paris Agreement. So then there is, I guess, the hard work of how do we actually get there, and what sort of agriculture and its role, and what part does soil carbon play in all of that. And so I'm going to touch on a bit of that now. So the Australian targets, obviously to get to 2050 is a massive ask. So there's a 43% reduction required below 2005 levels by 2030. Given we're a fair way along that path now, we've still got a fair way to go. We're currently, it's probably a bit more than this since I developed this slide, but there's a lot of action that needs to happen over the next 5 years to actually reduce those targets. And the big industries where that's happening is obviously electricity generation, transport, because they are the big emitters. But agriculture, I guess, has historically been seen as a way to offset emissions from other industries and has significant emissions in its own right that we have to deal with. So when we look at the projections for Australian agriculture, this is a historic view up to 2025, and then the projections forward for our emissions. I guess the main thing that really should strike you is, while we have these really steep reduction targets that we need to meet, the projections for agriculture are that we're not going to change very much. And I think this is a real projection, because we don't really have a lot of mechanisms to reduce emissions in our agricultural industries at the moment. The big change you can see historically has been the reduction in the sheep emissions, and that's all related to the number of head that's been run, and as there's been a transition into cattle or cropping from those sheep production areas. So most of our production is linked to the number of animals we have, and we haven't been able to break that link. And in the future, we're working on technology to do that, but there's not really any viable options to do that right at the moment, particularly in most of our extensive grazing situations. Probably the key thing to note when we're looking at this is the emissions side of the equation, and when we're looking at an agricultural system, we've got sequestration that also occurs through soils and trees, which doesn't actually come in this side of the ledger. It comes in a separate side called the land use LUCF side, and that's basically just a combination of soils and trees is the main task there. But the main reason I wanted to put this up is this is actually a projected contribution of all of these industries by 2030, and with the electricity sectors, this is where with all the projected activity that's going to come online by that time. And the first thing to sort of note is we've got still significant emissions, particularly things like transport, energy generation, and agriculture. But we've only got this one mechanism to offset those. And when you look at that as a whole, most of that offset is through trees, and there's only a relatively small amount of that offset is actually coming through in soil carbon that can be accounted for. So that's about 2 million tonnes that's coming through there. So while theoretically there's a lot of potential for soil carbon because of the large areas of land that's available for that to be implemented, actually making that happen in practice, documenting that it occurs, is a real challenge. And this is why our current projections don't have a high amount of soil carbon in them, because of those, I guess, those challenges that we've got to get across. And today I'll sort of walk through those with you. This is Carbon 101 reminder. It's a carbon cycle. If you've been to some of these presentations before, you've probably seen many different versions of this. This is one we did focusing mainly around grazing management. But the key thing that I wanted to emphasise by putting this up is that the main driver of soil carbon comes from photosynthesis and the contribution of plants to produce biomass that is then enters the soil So most of that is through roots and root exudates as that material sort of breaks down or through that stage of the plant. And then most of that carbon that enters the soil is actually respired back out, often relatively quickly within the first 12 months. And so we've got this constant cycle of biomass going in and biomass coming out. And the only way to increase soil carbon and maintain those increases is to have more biomass go in or to slow that respiration rate out. And so that can also be achieved by storing carbon in forms that are more stable. So things like some soil types have higher clay contents, and we get higher binding of carbon to the minerals in in those soils. There's other processes that can be manipulated to increase that storage as well. And things like adding additional nutrients into the soil can, say, facilitate the breakdown of the organic matter in the soil to more stable forms that have potential to be held and stay in the soil for longer. So that's just probably an overview of some of the major drivers there. And we've got this sort of interaction within the soil between nutrients, the residues that are going in, the soil organic matter pools that are there, and the microbial community that are driving that respiration process. We also do have things like soil erosion, which can contribute to losses generally on the surface, but they're very difficult to sort of attribute how much soil is actually lost in those processes. So the main aim of this presentation is to highlight a few key points here. The first one is that the difference in transient fluctuation in soil carbon to persistent gains. So I'll go into that in a lot more detail, what that actually means, but we have a lot of sources of variability that influence soil carbon, and just sort of trying to put some of those into perspective so that you can interpret some of the results you get when you go and sample paddocks or see change over time and those sorts of things. I'll also go into how that variability can make it hard to detect changes in soil carbon. I'm not really going to go down to the level of, well, what sort of soil sampling regime do you need to overcome that? I'm going to talk about it more from a practical and a systems point of view about the problems with it. How do we assess options for soil carbon? So if you are interested in looking at soil carbon, how do you assess what would be the best activities to implement on an area of land? I'll talk specifically about grazing management because of sort of some recent work we've done in that area and because it's so widely promoted to increase soil carbon. And finally, I'll sort of wrap it up with a bit of a vision for the role of soil carbon in the future, and more of an integrated role where we're looking at sort of the benefits of the management that's associated with increasing soil carbon can provide, and how we can integrate with other opportunities to stabilise sort of an income stream out of that if that's of interest or needed. Just this figure on the right here, it's sort of a hierarchy of sort of where we have a potential for soil carbon to reach, and then what actually limits this as we go down. And if you can think of this, often things will be proven, same as in a glasshouse study, or they might be proven in a small plot study over a short period of time. I'm not really going to address things that have evidence at that level. I'm going to be talking more about things that have gone down a few more of these steps where we've actually got some demonstrated economics behind the land use change that's associated with it. We've got some long-term data to understand the environmental constraints, which is a really big one. And I'm probably not going to get down to the last level, which is sort of this social political constraints that can actually impact on the implementation of some of these things. And that's rules, people's behaviours, those sorts of things as well. I'm just going to demonstrate this sort of temporal fluctuation type that we see. So temporal fluctuation just means variation that occurs over time. With some data that we collected from a long-term farming systems trial at Condobolin. So on this trial, we had 4 different farming systems that had soil carbon data collected for 16 years. And with that, we had a continuous cropping system, conventional cultivation system, reduced tillage system, and those conventional cultivation and reduced tillage had pasture phases in them as well, and then a perennial pasture that was sown and maintained over that whole 16 years. The really interesting thing about this study was it showed that we had this build-up in soil carbon over the first 12 years, with eventually the perennial pasture having a higher soil carbon level than the other systems at this point. But we had this decline in soil carbon, which was quite rapid after that 12-year period. And we really don't have a clear driver of that. So there was, I guess that driver was, we did have a really short, sharp, dry period that was very, very dry, but it wasn't a sustained and prolonged drought. And so the environmental drivers that might be associated with these reductions in carbon are not clear. And I know from some of the modelling work we've done, and we actually ran the APSIM soil carbon model at this site to try and model this change, and we couldn't get the model to pick up this reduction, and it's sort of consistent with some of the other work that we've done since, that the modelling can pick up generally the increases over a long period of time, but they don't pick up these short, sharp drops, and so the drivers of them are not really clear. Probably the other thing to say is with this study is we had the benefit that we had at the highest point in soil carbon was still there at the end. So we still had a benefit in the perennial pasture over the other systems. It's just that we had dropped back in soil carbon, and so that was, I guess, it still shows that we have good management does build carbon, but we've just got these we can have these other cycles that can, I suppose, really make it hard to sometimes show those differences in carbon. And particularly when we're doing a soil carbon project, you're often monitoring at a point in time, and then you monitor again that same paddock sort of 5 years down the track, or at other frequencies, and then all the carbon that's changed is actually a management change that's occurred in that paddock, where we know that there's a lot of environmental variability that is actually part of those changes as well. And so one of the key things is actually how do you tease that apart, because while that might result in a short-term windfall in increased carbon and the dollars that are associated with that, it also provides a risk into the future if that then does go down, and yeah, sort of what would happen in that situation. So probably one of the other things with this study, and I'm just going to bring up 2 points with this, is because previously I've sort of heard a lot of other commentary or questions about it. Did it happen further down? The answer to that is yes. What was driving it? It's actually an increase in particulate carbon, so not that mineral associated or humus carbon that is bound more tightly in the soil. And one of the other things is we've actually, during the time that we were looking at this study, we'd actually measured about 20 other farms around this area, and while those farms actually ended up with, I guess, the level that we sort of started with around that just over 1%, that top 10 centimetre was pretty common across that area. So when we were getting up here sort of closer to 2%, that's sort of well above what was being recorded in that district in farming systems under a whole heap of different management. So yes, we did have sort of the same response further down the profile in the the perennial pasture also having higher carbon than the other systems, but we also picked up that same drop. People ask, well, did you look deeper? We did. And we actually had soil samples down to 90 centimetres in this data as well. We just didn't report any data below 30 centimetres because there was no change in soil carbon or no significant change. So just to try and make it a bit more, and at the time we didn't realise the focus that people would have at a later date around soil carbon at depth. But I guess one of the key things, just picking up on that point, is we've looked at soil carbon in a lot of areas, and generally we don't see a lot of change at soil carbon at depth, or if we do, it's relatively small and it essentially has the same pattern of change as what's happening closer to the soil surface. So we wouldn't expect to see a lot of additional carbon being picked up at the surface if we hadn't seen the same level of soil carbon sequestration at the surface. And so for us, it's a simple resourcing issue. When we start to look at these things now, we choose not to go down to a metre often when we're doing our soil sampling and pull up at 30 to 40 centimetres because it just takes a lot more time and effort and means that we can't get as much spatial variation, which also causes a lot of error. So I guess picking up on this concept and then sort of looking at it in response to some of the more recent carbon projects that have been awarded, we pulled together, I was part of this study that was led by Elaine Mitchell from QUT, where they put forward this concept of sort of transient fluctuation and persistent gains. And so we know sort of things bump around a bit, but what we're sort of trying to look for is these longer term persistent trends that actually increase. And this is sort of a conceptual representation of what might actually be happening on the ground. We've got sort of things bouncing around a bit, and depending on when your measurement periods might fall as to the actual level of sort of sequestration that you might find. And if it happens to coincide with a period that's sort of quite high, then there's the potential for sort of overcrediting to occur that then might not be represented into the future. And so this study actually looked at this over a number of sites where credits had been awarded, but one of these sites, QUT, had actually been monitoring, intensively monitoring some of the paddocks that were actually part of the site. And so they had some data to actually look at sort of what actually occurred after the project had been awarded, and showed I suppose a trend that we've got here. So basically the project was awarded 12.5 tonnes of carbon over a period from 2016 to 2021, which is a very high rate of sequestration, like actually sort of probably even above the top end that we would see in long-term sort of or experimental data. While the project didn't, the research site didn't start at the beginning of that period, so there is a period where they've sort of had to estimate what they thought might have happened over that period. They actually had this starting carbon level at a very low period. It was the lowest biomass period just before sort of the drought broke. They did measure the same high levels of soil carbon and similar to what was measured in the reporting period, but then they also picked up a reduction in that soil carbon after sort of this grey line on the over on the right, and that sort of reduction that occurred after that 2021 period was a 50% reduction in the 0 to 30 and an 80% reduction of the carbon that had been built up in the 0 to 100. So I guess this additional data sort of highlights that there was probably a reasonable proportion of environmental variability that was part of that awarding of credits, as well as some potential for management that's actually in there as well. I guess one of the ways, and coming back to that sort of point I raised with the carbon cycle, is we'd expect to see more carbon going in So we should see an increase in productivity if, with a new land management change, if there is if that management is actually changing that biomass input to increase carbon. So this is from a conceptual point of view what we would expect to see, and this is just using NDVI as a proxy for pasture production. So we'd expect to see sort of the control area and the treatment area about the same for a period of time, and then once you've had that intervention, you should actually see a change to indicate that the management is having a large effect, or having an effect that's big enough to have a change in soil carbon. At that same site, this is sort of looking at that approach with the control in grey and the project in green. So it probably shows that there's not there wasn't the variation in the managed area compared to the unmanaged area. Also, sort of further supporting that it was a larger part environmental than management. So I guess taking a different take, this is some other long-term data. It's some CSIRO data, some data that's from a CSIRO long-term phosphorus trial down at Ginninderra in Canberra. This is a 20-year trial looking at different phosphorus rates. So the way to interpret the treatments here that are shown on the right is the P either has a P level of P0, so no phosphorus applied. P1, that was phosphorus applied to the optimum level for the system. So that was worked out with 5 easy steps where we would, when we're recommending phosphorus, we generally say that you put on a capital rate up front to get your soil test values to a certain level, and then over a period of time, you then have maintenance applications to keep the phosphorus at that level. And then the P2 was an excess phosphorus, and the aim of that was just to see whether, if you go beyond that level, whether there's any benefit in. This was looking at productivity primarily. We went back to the archives and pulled out the soil samples, and again, we've actually got periodically soil carbon to depth over this whole trial. Again, I'm just doing the 0 to 10 centimetres because that's just to make it easy, and we actually had data every year. So this trial actually sampled the soil every month for 20 years. We took it back to the same time in autumn every year just to get a consistent level. So the clear thing that came out of this was that there was a build-up in soil carbon with all the treatments that had phosphorus for the first sort of 10 or so years, and then it did even out after a period of time. So this is pretty much the standard, I suppose, hypothesis for how we think soil carbon will work. You have a period where you build it up, then under the same or similar management, it's sort of maintained into the future in time. What we've and the other two treatments here, sorry, I did forget to mention, is different stocking rates. And so the 9 means a stocking rate of 9 DSE per hectare, and the 18 means 18 DSE per hectare. Probably the other thing to note here is when we didn't put on phosphorus over a long period of time, there was this gradual mining of soil organic matter to provide phosphorus into that system. And interestingly, the highest stocking rate, I actually stopped that treatment because it didn't work after a period of time. And that's about when that decrease starts to level out. So that wasn't actually stopped from that period on. So the other thing I really wanted to highlight with this was the level of variability around these. So we've got annual data here to show what's happened, and it's from 3 replications, but you just see that there's a massive range in and variability around these average trends. And that's sort of part of the spatial variability that we see with soil carbon, as well as that change over time. And so it's why we actually need sometimes or often relatively high levels of sampling to get clear trends in data about what's actually occurring as well. So we're just writing up that data at the moment, and yeah, hopefully we should be able to get a paper out on that pretty soon. The other part of this was the stocking rate had pretty minimal influence, and so except in that degradation treatment where it evened out, in the phosphorus treatments it didn't. The other thing here with this purple one that did start to go down, while this is not a significant trend, that actually had phosphorus stopped midway through that experiment. So they had the standard rate of phosphorus to a point in time, and then they stopped, and it sort of is decreasing, probably at a slightly higher rate than the others. But again, that's not a significant trend in the data. And that variation was over relatively small plots. They weren't large paddocks that we were actually monitoring there. So when you're assessing soil carbon options, know your soil's potential. So how do you do that? Basically, you sort of need to have some understanding of the soil type influence and the climate influence, and how that might limit your soil carbon levels. And so it's basically related to how much clay you've got in the soil, and how much rain, and or how low your temperature is. The CSIRO has a tool called Look-See. They actually have some soil carbon estimate functions in there that look reasonable and sort of align and rely on sort of a lot of the SCARP, which was the National Soil Carbon Research Project data, I think all sits behind that tool. So that is a way to help you assess what your soil's potential might be in a given environment and under a given land use. When you're assessing the management change options, I think the key question you should be asking is productivity increased or disturbance reduced? They're the two things that really drive where the soil carbon is there. So we constantly see, or we often see, an increase in soil carbon when we move from a cropping system into a pasture system, and that's with a reduction in that disturbance. And we also see under higher nutrient systems where productivity is increased. That's the other site where we see reasonably consistent increases in soil carbon. Understand the requirements for measurements. And so while if you're doing an ACCU project, there's clear guidance dictating you on that. The reality is that the variation that you have there might not be covered well as well as it needs to be by those sampling protocols. And it's a real challenge and trade-off, because sampling costs a lot of money to do and to get high levels of data intensity to help understand the variability. But it's sort of key to understanding this. Excuse me. And then understand the source of variability and risk. And then also the dollars that might be associated with it as well. Excuse me. Sorry, I've had COVID this week, so I'm still recovering from that. With grazing management, we've actually looked at this in two different ways. The first of those was we looked at a meta-analysis, which is basically a study of all the previous studies that have been done on soil carbon in Australia. And we synthesise all that information into a finding about the expected change that we might see.
Warwick, do you want to just take a moment? Do you want to get some water? And you're okay.
Yeah, no, I'm okay. Okay. So with the grazing study, we looked at two main things. The first was grazing intensity or stocking rate, and the second one was grazing strategy, which is basically whether there's a significant period of rest in the system under grazing. And the results came out that sort of grazing intensity or stocking rate really didn't have as much impact as we thought it might. But it did impact the other things that we know stocking rate would impact, like plant growth rate, herbage mass, ground cover. Similarly with grazing strategy, we found that it didn't have a significant benefit for soil carbon, but did have higher impacts for for herbage mass and ground cover as well. So I guess that's sort of synthesising all the findings that are out there. But we sort of understand that there's a lot of variability that's probably masking some of the potential impacts that might occur there as well. The other, I guess, bit of work we've done is we've been running a grazing trial looking at different forms of grazing management in orange for the last 12 odd years, and we're still continuing that trial now. But we actually we've got a paper that's just under review at the moment, where we've looked at the soil carbon in that trial between 2012 and 2021. So one of the key things that has occurred is we've had a build-up in soil carbon across the site, regardless of how it's been grazed. But the intensive rotational grazing treatments have increased carbon more than the continuous graze treatments, only by about 0.15 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. So, and there was little difference in how grazing management was actually implemented within those systems on soil carbon. So, again, that's a sort of a lot smaller change in soil carbon than what we had, I guess, has been found by the soil carbon ACCU projects and has been widely promoted. The other interesting bit of this is we've sampled this site again and only recently got the data back, and which we're still analysing, but it indicates that we've lost all the soil carbon at that site as well. Again, we've got this temporal fluctuation, and we're still working out whether the gains that we saw between systems are actually maintained when it's gone down. But again, we don't have a clear driver for why that soil carbon has gone down. But yeah, just indicating that it has. So it does highlight sort of that variability that we've got. So I just want to pick up on a few other points, and I'll try and move through a bit more quickly now, so we've got a little bit of time for questions. When we look into the future, if there are environmental drivers, and we do use some models to try and predict those, then under some of the higher warming scenarios, then there is looking like potential to lose significant amounts of carbon, particularly from our rangelands. And so, again, like I guess the reason I wanted to put this up was that it highlights that when we're going into a project, we have these future climate risks. You will have to be maintaining that carbon into the future, and there is going to be a climate that is going to be a lot harder to store carbon than what we're currently in as we go forward. I guess I didn't want this to be all negative, because soil carbon provides a lot of benefits within a system, and particularly the management that is associated with it. And I think this is sort of part of our problem, is when we focus too much on carbon for carbon credits, you lose sight of what else we're often managing agricultural systems, and what are the other values in those systems that we get from improvements to management. And this is I guess trying to highlight the value of that. So there was some modelling work done by Rachel Meyer, and basically looked at a high soil carbon scenario and a low soil carbon scenario with different soil types at two different locations, and then looked at the value that additional soil carbon provides, either in mineralised nitrogen in production, or and then converting that through to dollar values if in extra forage, if you had to go and buy that as supplementary feed, or if you had to go and purchase that as urea to put into the system. And those values are often quite high, and can be significantly higher than the carbon that is sequestered. And so I just wanted to sort of highlight that is a potential benefit, that you're getting these other things that are part of this management system. The flip side of that is if you're building soil carbon and it takes nutrients, which it does, because organic matter has often reasonably consistent levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and potassium that are maintained. So you don't just build carbon, you actually build organic matter with these other nutrients associated. Then there is often some cost associated with this. Some work that John Kierkegaard and his team did on their long-term hardened trial. So I looked at this in detail. They had a strategy where they put on additional nutrients to build soil carbon over 2 phases. So you can look at this on this figure on the right, what they actually did up to phase, and we're looking at here at the end of this phase 3. The additional nutrients that they put to build that carbon cost about a bit over $1,100 a hectare. It built up 9.8 tonnes of carbon per hectare, which was worth about a bit over $1,400 a hectare. There were also some increases in crop yield at about $837 a hectare. So over that 8-year period, there was a significant increase in the benefit from putting on those additional nutrients. But because we've got these permanence issues with soil carbon, so if you're getting paid for it to put it into the soil, you have to then maintain it into the future. And so this trial wasn't designed to sort of look at supplying those additional nutrients into the future. It just sort of went to a new phase where they brought those systems back together and put the same level of nutrients on, but looked at what the outcome would be at the end of that period if they did that. And one of, I guess, the key things is if they stopped putting on those additional nutrients, that the soil carbon benefit dropped back. And so there was only 3 tonnes of carbon difference between the low and the high nutrient system at the end of that period. The value of that's obviously reduced because you've got less carbon. And it actually resulted in a loss. And they did in the paper sort of say that if you had an optimized nutrient strategy, that you might be able to get a small profit out of that. But I think it highlights that the main thing is you're investing in something to increase soil carbon. You have to keep investing in it to maintain that soil carbon at a higher level. And there is still inherent variability that it might go backwards anyway. Okay, final things I just wanted to pick up is really around integrated systems. So when we look at this, say, from a livestock perspective, which is example on the left here, you might, say, put in some deep-rooted legumes that increase your nitrogen in your system, builds biomass, increases soil carbon. But because it's part of a farming system, very few farmers just let that additional biomass rot on the ground, and there's often an increase in animal numbers to eat that additional feed. And so you might have then an increase in emissions that are associated with that. So you really need to look at all of these things from a systems perspective. And the Ginninderra long-term trial, when we looked at that from a systems perspective, the higher stocking rate, if phosphorus was required to actually maintain that, which it was, then what the additional animals that were put on basically offset the half a tonne of carbon per hectare per year that was put on. So there's 2 ways you can look at that. You're saying, well, you've got no additional carbon to sell, but you can also say that you're actually halving the emissions profile of the animals that are produced from that additional site, if you're accounting for soil carbon in that system as well. So it does have benefits, but we do need to view this from a systems perspective. I guess this option of stacking integrated interventions is one that we're sort of working towards. The integrated farmland management method, ACCU method, is one that's just trying to put together mainly trees and soil carbon as a first step. But we probably need to do a lot more in that space. And I'd say, can we integrate soil carbon with biodiversity and nature repair markets, or can we integrate with low emissions pasture and management strategies, which on both of these probably are options where we can take to actually have benefits on both sides. And what this does is, if we've got these other sources of income that are coming in and benefits from a management change or an activity, then it reduces the risk around the carbon component of that. And I think this is where we need to be heading, because I think I've demonstrated that there's a lot of variability and potential risk with soil carbon if you're just looking at it on its own. But there's also a lot of benefit from management that's associated with increasing soil carbon to either a farm business and often for some of these other benefits like biodiversity or nature repair. So I think we need to be really focusing around a lot more of a stacking approach with soil carbon to sort of reduce some of the risk that's actually associated with it. So just in summary, I think understand the differences between transient fluctuation and persistent gains in soil carbon. Just because you measure a change in soil carbon between 2 points doesn't necessarily mean that it's due to the management that you've imposed in that area, and it might actually be associated with variability. And so repeat sampling can really help determine and tease apart some of those differences. There are real limits to where and when soil carbon will increase, and I think if you're looking at soil carbon, just go about this in quite a systematic way before you implement a project. First of all, know the emissions risks in your business if you're running a farming business, and then look at sort of what potential you might have to increase carbon if you're looking at a management change that helps to sort of address some of those risks. And I think with grazing management, there's just we've sort of probably clearly demonstrated sort of limited ability when you're comparing it, if you're comparing it to other land management at that time. So you may measure soil carbon changes over time, but they might not necessarily be associated with grazing management. They might be more environmental variability. And so look at sort of some of the things that would. And I think the last one is sort of soil carbon is part of an integrated system, and we need to view it that way. And so to reduce risk on the value of a management change, I think we need to treat soil carbon more as a co-benefit and focus on the benefits to the farming system or in other markets as more of a major source. So I made it without dying. No, that's all I've got. So I'll hand it over to the questions.
Thank you so much, Warwick. That was fabulous. Are there any questions from anyone in the room? Daniela, do you want to come off mute and ask your question? It's a very valid one.
Hi, hello, it's Bob here on Daniela.
Oh, sorry, Bob.
That's all right. Don't tell her I snuck on. Warwick, thanks. That was an outstanding presentation. Thank you. Quick question from me, though, was, any guidance around what happens with the soil carbon with the bushfires? So scenario, you've gone out there in a project, planted lots of trees, doing the right thing, and then bang, we get hit by a bushfire. What's the kind of guidance around that, please?
Look, there's not a lot of data that I'm aware of around soil carbon and fire, but there's actually two processes that are happening there, and one is you're actually getting ash or charcoal deposition, and you're obviously removing biomass and potentially even sort of burning some of the carbon that's at the very top of the soil as well in that sort of litter matter that's sort of partially integrated with the soil surface. So it depends on the fire intensity. The long-term sort of trial data around burning crop stubble says that it does have a small reduction over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. But if you've got a single bushfire event, I would be surprised if you detect a difference in soil carbon unless there's significant levels of erosion that's occur afterwards. So that's I guess my interpretation of what might happen, but there's not a lot of data to help support that, I guess.
No. Okay. All right. That's helpful. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob. So Warwick, I have a question from Adriana. She's asked she's got background noise, so I'm just going to read out a question. Warwick, would you like to comment on whether or not your work has focused on shifting the dial either up or down? And what are the three main principles you'd highlight for a landholder wanting to sequester?
Yeah, look, I think that the big driver seems to be nutrients. In all the work where we get consistent and prolonged responses is where there's been a nutrient increase. So I know something like phosphorus fertilizer is not necessarily popular for people who are particularly looking at sort of regenerative type approaches to this, but the most consistent response we've seen to increase soil carbon in pastures is with superphosphate fertilizer, and we suspect that that's not only increasing productivity but also a nutrient relationship that's driving the stabilisation of that organic matter in the soil as well. So you're actually reducing some of that mineralisation loss as well. So that's one side of things, and yeah, I don't know. The more I look at data over time, the more I'm amazed at sort of these changes that are often quite large. And so if you go out and measure sort of fence line comparisons, you don't necessarily see this because you just see the result of what's happened over a long period of time. So you're getting more that sort of consistent change, particularly if you've got confidence that the fence has been put in place and the management was consistent beforehand. And it takes out a lot of that variability. And so once we start looking at a control and a practice over time, and we've got both recorded, then I really am quite amazed just how much variation that we do see with some of those systems.
Thank you, Warwick. Andrew, Jack, do you want to come off mute and ask your question? Okay, I can see that you're off mute, but I can't seem to hear you. So with that, I will ask a question for you. So it says, issue with calculating organic matter required to increase organic carbon levels, especially in pasture systems.
So I'll take that as sort of how much biomass do you need to go back in to increase soil carbon levels, and it's actually there's a fair bit going on because it's related to the often the carbon to nitrogen ratio of that so the other nutrients associated with the biomass. So if you put on cardboard, it sort of or something that's very high in carbon, it might break down slowly, but it also might not be retained in the soil. So there's sort of a few different processes that sort of come together. Often things that sort of are highly labile, so they've got high nutrient content, might break down really quickly, but they're supplying more nutrients, so that sort of acts in a quickening, I guess, a self-sustaining cycle of being more productive and helping to maintain a bit more of that carbon in the system, where the slow stuff might slowly break down, but it's not adding a lot of extra nutrients to the system, so that eventually it is slowly lost or respired over time. So you've got sort of quite a bit of dynamics that do occur with some of these systems.
Fabulous. Okay, Susie, you have a question. Would you like to ask yours?
Yeah, thanks, Camilla. Hi, Warwick. Thanks for that great presentation. That had heaps of great stuff in it that was really well accessible. I wanted to just ask about this idea about dynamic baseline measurements for soil carbon crediting purposes. And I don't know very much about it, but it is something I've been reading a little bit more about. Can you offer any guidance, or do you have any experience using that baseline measurement where my understanding is they use a cohort of plots in the district and measure the carbon levels annually and compare them against each other rather than from one single plot in the past to a future measurement. Is that, am I getting that right there?
Yeah, that's basically I think a principle that they're working off is that you've got areas that are sort of almost like reference sites for different land managements that are monitored into the future in different areas. There's a bit of work going on at the moment, particularly with a Net Zero Ag CRC, to set up a series of flux tower sites where they actually monitor some of those. So it's not near the level of network that's needed to sort of do that well, but it's sort of part of a process to understand sort of these fluctuations and what's driving it. And so the other bit with the fluctuations, with the flux towers, is they can proportion sort of, or we get a bit better idea of proportioning what's actually occurring at the site. So whether it's all, like whether we're losing large amounts of respiration, actually pick that up in the signal through the flux towers compared to the productivity or that's occurred at that time. And so you can sort of put together the story a bit more. So I think if we're serious about trying to do something large scale with carbon, then I think it's somehow developing that dynamic baseline approach would probably need to be part of it.
Thanks, Susie. That's great.
Thanks,
Carl, are you able to come off mute? Possibly not. Okay, so the question in the chat is, hi Warwick, what confidence would you have that ACCUs awarded are real, even if inflated by environmental conditions? As the projects are not open to external analysis, we don't know about the others. What are the chances the awarded projects are outliers?
Look, I think there's potential for that. I guess there's no requirement. I guess we see the projects get awarded when they meet the conditions. So when there's when actually there's sequestration there's variation, but there's always a lot of variation. Anyone who's dealing with soil carbon understands this. There's like massive amounts of variation out there, and so with that, you can be accurately representing that, or you might have some skewed distribution on that depending on the number of soil cores and how it's being done. So so there is potential for exactly what Carl's put forward there, that they might be just representing some of that variability rather than and the other point I think is having a large scale publicly accessible database to look at these trends and would really help to understand what's going on at a broader level. So I really would support that. I mean, I think research would love to have that so we could help to build models that better capture this or represent this. Because I mean, the ultimate thing is if we'd have to keep going digging holes all the time, it's not going to be viable. So I think we need to come back to some sort of estimate or model approach, but it just needs to be robust, and we need to be able to. And the only way we can do that is having really large data sets to support, I think. And there's a lot of advances with machine learning type approaches at the moment where we could get, I think, probably overcome some of the problems we've got with the current models and better represent some of these processes that they don't represent as accurately.
I do have a question on that. Because the soil from the core doesn't go back in the hole, right? We do the testing, we keep the core, and then that snapshot, that timeline is just put into an archive. Is that right? So you're constantly removing soil out of the system. Is that correct?
It should. Best practice is to try and archive those soils. I don't know whether it happens in all occasions, and even when we're trying to do it from a research perspective, sometimes you go back to your archive and the soils are either not in a condition that they can be used, or someone's decided to clean up while you weren't looking and they're not there, or not all of them are there. So yeah, it's not a perfect relying on that. The data is, as long as you know where as long as the metadata associated with this the actual values is robust, then that really helps, I think, with being able to interpret that historic data. And there's some good data sets like the SCARP data set that is publicly available and out there, and there was a lot of dollars and effort put into pulling those together, but they're a snapshot in time and they don't follow sites over time, which is the biggest issue that we've got. And I know they have gone back and resampled some of those recently, but we need to do it probably at a lot higher frequency than every 10 years or so.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you, Warwick. We've got one final question. Sean, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Did I
Thank
come
you.
off mute?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sweet. G'day, Warwick. Warwick, one of the messages you gave was around increasing the pasture productivity, so increasing the fertility, etc., etc. So my question relates to, are there any messages or understanding around the effective pasture utilisation rate in grazing systems? So if we're suddenly producing more tonnes per hectare because we've ramped up the productivity of the pasture, but we similarly increase the grazing intensity, so we have a commensurate increase in the utilisation rate, do we still build soil C?
One of the big challenges with that is we generally are only looking above the ground and we don't know what's happening below the ground as far as root allocation goes. But generally, if you're looking at increasing the productivity above ground, you are getting increasing root mass below the ground as well. And that's what's actually contributing to the soil carbon. A lot of the biomass that's on the surface doesn't necessarily work its way down into the soil very quickly or well. I think it's lost through some of those respiration processes. So I think the main mechanism for that would actually be through the root, more roots in the soil, more root exudates in the soil actually supplying the carbon more so. And that's, it is impacted by utilisation, but the work done on stocking rate shows it's not, it doesn't seem to be a big driver, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the basic message of grow more material.
Yep, seems to hold, I think, even if you're grazing it.
Yep, cheers.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks.